Hi, welcome to Fish. First I seek him, and my name is Linda. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. Romans 12:2. The Bible talks about transformation and transfiguration. If we study these words, we learn that they both come from the Greek word metamorpho, meaning to change into another form. We have a great example of this process of metamorphosis in tadpoles, which are really cute, by the way, which become frogs, and caterpillars, which I don't think are that cute, that become butterflies. A caterpillar changing into a butterfly is the best example of metamorphosis. A caterpillar eats until it grows to a certain size, and at that time it surrounds itself with a covering known as a cocoon, which it spins, and it may be hidden behind a piece of loose bark or it burrows into the ground. And well, you could say this is a kind of burial, right? So we can relate to the thought of burial because the Bible teaches us that we must die to self in order to live wholly in Christ. The Apostle Paul said in Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live is in the body I live by faith, in which the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. Now, I have experienced this dying to self, and it sometimes really hurts, and I still experience it. And when God is dealing with me about something, well, I want it that it's not his will for me. It's just things to die to, if that makes any sense. I mean, sometimes I really don't realize it until he shows me, and then I feel really bad. He shines a light on like my attitudes or my thought patterns or ways of acting and speaking and plans and desires. And it's much easier to discuss it, right, than to actually experience it. So whether physical or is in the spiritual realm, death on any level, is painful, or sometimes shameful too. We don't always know ourselves, but he knows us. So it can also be shameful. And there's no such thing now as the cross without pain. Jesus said to take up our cross and follow him. And Jesus called the throng with his disciples and said to them, if anyone intends to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow with me. Mark 8:3-4. Just as the caterpillar experiences metamorphosis and transforms into a butterfly, so must we go through changes that require a type of death. When these changes God desires to see in us begin to take place, well, they're painful. And as the caterpillar appears to find a place to hide in silence, God also provides for us. And I have experienced that many times, and sometimes I feel really lonely, but then I realize it's God having like a honeymoon with you. He's going to take you to a place and he's going to work on you. And he's going to isolate you from everything else so that you will know that it's him. And dying to self, well, it can also be messy. It is not something we can share with everyone we know. Yeah. God assigns to each of us what I call the silent years. These are years when God has us hidden, and he is doing a great work in us. He's changing us into his image so that we can live for his glory. So the silent years, the men and women who God used greatly, men and women in the Bible that God used greatly had to go through some silent years. This was a period of time in their lives when God seemed to hide them away while he worked in them and made changes in their character. And that would be necessary. It was absolutely necessary for their future assignment. So for example, Moses. Moses was a man who felt that he had the call of God on his life, but he had been taking matters into his own hands, right? He saw one of his brothers, a Hebrew, being mistreated by an Egyptian overseer, and Moses murdered the Egyptian. God did not lead Moses to take this action. No, he did not. Moses acted emotionally. His heart attitude may have been in the right place, but he did not approve of mistreating innocent people. You know what I'm saying? He didn't approve of mistreating innocent people. However, his timing was off. All right? This was totally Moses' will, not God's. So being out of God's timing is equivalent to being out of his will. Yes, it is. There you go, hand in hand. So before Moses could be used by God, he needed to learn some really hard lessons. And when his actions were discovered and he was confronted, Moses fled from Egypt in fear. Another action God did not direct him to take. So we can see from this one example that Moses was impatient and fearful. Character traits that would need to be removed before God can do the great thing with Moses he had planned. Moses fled to the wilderness, the desert, and spent 40 years herding goats, or something along that line. He married, had children, and time on his hands to spend with God. These were his silent years. His destiny was to lead, the Jews out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. During his silent years, it probably didn't make much sense to Moses any more than, some of the places we find ourselves to be in, right? It doesn't make sense to us. The Bible does not give a detailed account of those years. They were apparently years in which things took place between God and Moses, which were private and probably very painful. Moses had left everything he was familiar with, that he grew up with. He left his family, his friends, his position in life. We got to remember, he was the prince of Egypt. And when Moses went into the wilderness, you could say he had a huge ego. Yes, he did. He was self-serving, cocky, and egotistical. And when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush and told him he was chosen to lead the Jews out of Egypt and to the Promised Land, we see a very different man. He was now humbled. God had to get angry to get him moving in faith. Into the wilderness he entered, a man full of himself, leaving the wilderness, the meekest of men. Meekness is not weakness. It is strength under control. He always had strength, Moses. It was just not controlled. Now, he was strong with God behind his actions, and this was the metamorphosis of Moses. He was transformed. Now, some principle applies to Abraham. The same. In Genesis, we learn about a man named Abram who was called by God to leave his family, his home, his land, and travel to a place where God only knows. So imagine leaving everything behind to venture forth into the unknown. That's a lot. And as a result of his radical obedience, which it really is, God made some radical promises to Abram. Promises of blessing, wealth, fame, leadership, and a nation. God entered into a covenant with Abram, telling him if he believed, it would be counted unto him as right standing with God. Abram believed God. What a statement. God asks us to believe, not just for things, but through things. So for instance, Abram was believing God for a child that would be his heir, but he had to believe God through some difficult and lengthy things before he witnessed the manifestation of the promised child. You could say those years of waiting were his silent years. And during those years, we see Abraham taking action that was not God-inspired when he followed his wife's advice, Sarah, and slept with her handmaiden, Hagar, to be his secondary wife, if you will. They were tired of waiting for God's promise, so they took matters into their own hands. And sure enough, Hagar became pregnant and gave birth to Ishmael. God did not back Abraham's actions, and, well, he made them wait. Abraham was 100 years old when Sarah gave birth to Isaac. And by the way, Sarah was in her 90s. And also, by the way, God changed Abraham's name to, well, Abraham, I've been saying it, upon his promise, and it means father of a multitude, because God made him the father of many nations. All right, so let's move on to Joseph. He was a young man who had a dream from God. He impetuously shared his dream with his brothers, who became jealous and decided to do away with him. They sold Joseph into slavery and informed their father, Jacob, that a wild animal killed him. Joseph was taken to Egypt, where he spent many difficult years. And Joseph, he experienced hardship after hardship and eventually was imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. But God had a plan. The Bible tells us about the course of events he experienced outwardly. However, we don't know, nor we can imagine, what he experienced inwardly. The pain we have inside is much more than the pain of our circumstance. It may come from years of not understanding what is happening, or why, or from people who misunderstand us and judge us critically. We don't realize at the stage of metamorphosis that we are still caterpillars. We may say we want to do the right thing, but our character flaws will prevent us from doing it. God must change us. There is no other way. Like Jesus, we may face many tests that we must learn during the silent years. Just think how many people Joseph had to forgive, how willing he had to be not to become bitter and resentful as the years passed, and it seemed he had been forgotten. But suddenly, events changed drastically. Joseph had a reputation of dream interpretation. The Pharaoh one night had a troubling dream and sent for Joseph. God gave Joseph wisdom, and his interpretation was 100% accurate. Joseph was promoted to chief steward, the overseer of all of Pharaoh's possessions. Famine came into the land, but God had Joseph trained and ready to preserve the multitudes of people alive during this time in history, and Joseph endured silent years. He learned, he grew under God's direction and thrived. He was a second under Pharaoh. He was reunited with his brothers and he saw his father again. John the Baptist. Yes, we're going to go to John the Baptist, also experienced silent years. In Luke chapter 1, we read about the birth of John. Verse 80 of chapter 1 reads, "And the little boy grew and became strong in spirit, and he was in the deserts until the day of his appearing to Israel." We really know nothing about John the Baptist from the time of his birth to the beginning of his ministry, described in Luke 3:2, except that he spent many years living in the wilderness. That's it. These were the years that the Holy Spirit trained John for his future. His ministry was short but powerful. A special time in history, a very special time in history, and everything had to be right. The more intense our training, the greater our destiny will be. Much the same is true of Jesus. After his birth, except for his circumcision and dedication in the temple in Jerusalem, when he was 8 days old, we read really nothing about him until he was 12 years old. And then from 12 until about 30, almost nothing at all is recorded about Jesus. During his silent years, he grew and increased in favor with both God and man. The statement, "the child grew," is revealing. This passage, Hebrews 5:8-9, teaches us that he learned obedience through what he suffered, and his completed experience made him perfectly equipped to become the author and source of eternal salvation. In his humanity, Jesus had to learn to mature, to suffer, and gain experience. He never sinned, like us, but he led the way, and he is the way. And during these silent years, all these men, as well as Jesus, spent much time in praise and worship. It was their personal time with God. They were troubled, upset, worried about all the changes that needed to be made. And we worry about the same things, but why struggle, right? I mean, why not enter the rest of God? Struggling won't change you. The more you rest in God, the faster you will change. If the canvas struggled under the artist's brush, the painting would never be finished. The canvas is still totally submitted to the artist's wisdom and creativity. We need to be God's canvas, to enter his rest and have him recreate us for his purpose and glory and our freedom and joy in him. Well, that's it for Fish. First I Seek Him. My name is Linda, and until next time.